We want to finish off this playlist by talking about some more advanced features of the Scala language that will wind up being significant for us in our programming. We'll start with named and default arguments. So when we write methods, such as these methods here with def, sometimes you have methods that have multiple arguments to them. And a good example of this might be something I'm taking the average for students' grades in a class. So we'll just call this grade. And their grade comes from several components. So they have some quizzes, which of course these are all ints, so I'm going to pass in a list of ints. They also have some assignments, which is also a list of int. And they have maybe some tests, which is also, hey, once again, a list of int. And the whole thing is going to give us back a double. Now, the challenge with this method, and we can put in our handy little triple question marks here, so there aren't any errors. The challenge is when we call this. So if I call grade and list of 45, 98, list of 87, 69, list of, 83. All three arguments have the same type, and that's potentially confusing when you're using this because you might forget, well, and obviously Eclipse can help you out here, but it's not always obvious what argument is going to what. So Scala supports the ability to have named arguments. And so when I pass things in, normally the order determines where things are. So this first argument is going to be quizzes, the second argument is going to be assignments, and the third argument is going to be tests. But it is actually possible in Scala, if I could spell these things correctly. So assignments, how about tests, quizzes? You can provide names for the arguments instead. This is not their order down here. This list will wind up being used for the assignments, this one for the tests, and this one for the quizzes. You can also mix named and unnamed arguments in that if you don't put names on the first several, they will just go in their position, and then you can name things after that. Now, where this can be even more helpful is when you combine it with default arguments. So there are situations where maybe it's helpful to leave off some arguments because you know that there's a reasonable default value. So in the case of the tests, maybe it makes sense to sometimes call this and not provide any test grades. Okay. Well, in that case, we can do that, and we call this with assignments and quizzes, and the tests will wind up being nil. Okay. So you have the ability, when you call things, to provide the names, and then you can flip around the order. For certain situations, that's easier to read. Most of the time, it's just more verbose, but we'll actually see later on there's a feature built into Scala that makes really good use of this. It's what are called case classes. There's a method in them that's where the named arguments are really helpful, and also turns out all of those named arguments have default values. Combining the two is really useful because then you can only provide the things that you want. If you don't use named arguments, you have to provide everything at the beginning of the argument list, and you can leave the defaults to the end, but it's possible that maybe I wanted all of these to have default values. And then I could actually not provide a quiz value, and now the quiz would take on the nil. Okay, so this gives you some flexibility, and when you have methods that have really long argument lists, combining named arguments and default arguments makes it a lot easier for people to work with your code.